Lisa, a warm welcome to the New Female Leader Show. How are you today?
I'm doing just fine, thank you.
It's great to have you here. And before we dive in, I will introduce you to our listeners. You are a well known person in the field of philanthropy, and you are a committed social activist and worked at governments, NGOs, foundations, and you've lived and worked all over the world in New York, Washington, D.C., Amsterdam, Tokyo, Brussels, and now you're currently back in The Hague as the director of the Draper Richard Kaplan Foundation, where you play a leading role in investing and supporting social enterprises. You are the co author of the book NGO Accountability, Politics, Principles, and Innovations, and ranked in 2018's top 10 influencers in Dutch civil society. You're married and you have two sons. Wow, Lisa, it's such an impressive career. I really can't wait to dive deeper into your personal journey and into your ideas around social entrepreneurship. So I would say let's start immediately. And can you share I would say in a nutshell, because it's so, yeah, you have such a big career, but can you share a bit on your journey in the nonprofit sector?
So I thank you so much, Caroline, and I'm so thrilled to be here and to have the opportunity to spend some time with you this morning.
Thank you.
Um, when I think about the nonprofit sector, I think about the social sector.
Right.
Because when you talk about the social sector, you are immediately orienting people to impact and the value of creating change and solving socially complex problems, which has really more or less driven my entire career from working in the US Congress, which is where I started, to running NGOs and building programs at NGOs, which I did for quite some time. And then the last, I don't want to say how many years, but the last decades
Right.
in philanthropy,
Right.
with philanthropies in the United States and philanthropies here in Holland.
Mm-hmm.
And the driving force, I think, behind all of the opportunities that I've been so privileged to be able to realize has been the key issue has been, how do we create equity in our world?
Mm-hmm.
How do we make sure everybody gets heard? And how do we make sure that we have good social contracts between each other? So everything that I've done, including the wonderful opportunity to develop the international headquarters of the Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation here in The Hague, is about building equity in the world, solving complex social problems, and making sure that everyone has the right to shape and participate in the societies within which they live.
Yes. And when you talk about building equity in this world, Lisa, can you elaborate a bit more on that? What does that actually mean?
Yeah, it means things like Energy Peace Partners, which is the last deal of 2020 that we were able to make at Draper Richards Kaplan, where you have 1 billion people on the planet who are living in conflict or
Mm-hmm.
have fled conflict, and they don't have access to stable electricity. They don't have access to street lamps at night. They don't have access to be able to, plug in their mobile phone more than an hour a day, which means they don't have access to information, et cetera.
Yeah.
And Energy Peace Partners has figured out a way in which to take the clean energy market into these conflict zones and into refugee camps and into internally displaced humanitarian camps.
Wow.
For me, that's equity. We have access. Do they have access? How do we get access to people who don't have it? To
Right.
very basic life and livelihood needs, so that they have the opportunity to grow their livelihoods. They have opportunity to learn. They have opportunity to participate, and are not sitting in the dark somewhere.
Right. So, and Lisa, what made you want to work in this field because you already studied in this direction, so you were very determined that you wanted to make a change, as at least that seems from your career path.
I will have to tell you that it was a sister of mercy who, when I was a teenager,
Mm-hmm.
this is a true story.
Okay.
When I was a teenager, there was this very powerful sister of mercy in my high school.
Mm-hmm.
And she recognized that she recognized all of the children's gifts, in fact. And the gift that she recognized within me, which of course, when you're 15 or 16, you don't really recognize within yourself, is that I could be inspirational and I could motivate people.
Mm.
And so, and I cared about, how my fellow student was doing, even if I didn't know them. I would often ask her, how's Caroline doing? Or how's John doing? Or so on and so forth. And so she took me under her wing when I was very young, and asked me to help talk through family issues between kids who were on drugs and their parents, often coming from very bad households, and a number of other activities like this, where you actually had the opportunity to help people understand each other,
Mm-hmm.
where they couldn't, where the messages couldn't get through. And her whole life was devoted to helping people like this. And she was, she took a vow of poverty. She was a sister of mercy.
Yes.
So, but she also had a very strong social justice frame or set of ideas. And she was a citizen of the world. So she was looking at what was happening in El Salvador at the time, where there was a war going on that was quite vicious. And in Honduras and so on and so forth. And so she's really the reason why I took the path that I took. Sister
Wow.
Pat, she's the reason.
Wow. And have you ever, since you took that path, doubted about your path?
Well, the path is not straightforward. It's not like I decided to go to work for Unilever or Nabisco,
No, exactly.
or whatever it happens to be, and decided that I was going to climb a corporate ladder somewhere. So the path only makes itself clear, of course, in hindsight.
Mm.
That's when you figure out, oh, that's why I thought that would be an interesting choice.
Mm.
But in every juncture, there was an opportunity to live the values. So I'll give you an example. When I left university, I took a bus to Washington, D.C., and I read the voting patterns of the members of Congress who were serving in the House, and found 5 who consistently worked or voted in the way that I thought was socially just. And then I knocked on their doors every day for 3 months until one of them gave me a job.
Wow.
So, and that was a very determined, specific, this is how I'm going to be able to work on human rights. This is how I'm going to be able to work on women's rights. This is how I'm going to be able to influence the state of our planet. Those kinds of things.
So would you say that these turns and curves that you took on your path, were they intuitive, or was something else at play?
They were intuitive. They also, every single one of them gave me an opportunity to learn.
Okay.
And I think that including the Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation, which works firm by firm or enterprise by enterprise. So that's not a public policy play at all. Very different kind of way in which to create systemic change or social change than I have worked in previously. So every time there was a way in which to think about what are you going to learn so that you're a better person on the other end of this opportunity. Are you going to be wiser, stronger? Are you going to have the more tools in your toolbox? So that has always been a huge question for me every time I've taken up an opportunity that has been presented.
Right. And I'm also curious about that intuitive part. Can you give words to that, to that, yeah, um, feeling, or like I'm writing currently a book for new female leaders, and I'm at the chapter of intuition, and I'm very curious how that works. So how did that work for you? Can you describe that a bit deeper?
So sometimes when you're going to take a career choice, it's so clear, right? When I left Capitol Hill and I went to the Netherlands for the first time, this was not a totally sure thing, but I needed to have some more education, and I knew that, and I needed to have some kind of intellectual frame for all of the things that I had done for 5 years in creating public policy.
Right.
And I didn't have it. So how was I gonna get that? And so it was an intuitive move to decide to go back to university and study some more. People do this. Mostly they go straight shot, but nothing for me is ever a straight shot. It just doesn't work that way. But I knew I needed something. I needed some more tools to understand what global social movements were, why people were organizing beyond their national borders to create social change. I just needed to understand if there were theories behind this. And there were, in fact. Then one other moment that was really intuitive was when I stopped working as a social activist and went into philanthropy.
Okay.
And that is a big change. And people don't realize that. People on either side of that equation don't understand. If you are searching for funds and you're searching for people to support your cause, it pulls upon one set of skills. If you are the one who's making the decision about who to support, it pulls on an entirely different set of skills. And a lot of that is intuitive. So you're no longer the one who's leading the investigation. You know, if you're a lawyer, you're no longer the one who's leading a protest. If you're a social activist, you're no longer the one who's framing the debate that you're going to have with the institution whose actions may not really be protecting the human rights of another individual. And when you're an activist, that's what you do. You fight for people. When you're a philanthropist, what you do is you try and understand the entire landscape.
Right.
And figure out in the landscape of, for example, women's rights, where are the levers that the community can pull in order to create equity for women worldwide? Or where are the centers of power around the questions around environment that you need to work on in order to protect the planet? Where are they and what do they look like? Because there are millions of ways in which to be able to do this. So you have to have a very full landscape view.
Right.
And really, you don't need that when you're a social activist at all.
And I can imagine that it's much more political also, right? I mean, you have to work with what is there right now. I mean, you cannot fight against. You have to really liaise with every party that is involved, and you have to somehow get everyone that on that right track. I can imagine that that's also that you need a completely different skill set for that.
You do. And that was the attraction of moving from social activism into philanthropy.
Right.
Where you're still a social activist, but just not in the same kind of way. And on being political, in both positions, I think you are quite political. One is you have a demand, and you want to see that demand fulfilled. So I wanted Indigenous rights to be protected. I wanted human rights to be protected. I wanted women's rights to be protected. And I wanted to make sure that the planet, the planetary resources were okay. So these were always the motivating factors: rights and the planet. It doesn't change. It's still the same.
Okay.
Some odd years later. But how to make that happen, your vehicles, your tools, when you get a much wider playing field, which you do when you go to work for a big foundation, it's a much, much wider playing field. So I went to work for the Ford Foundation when I was 36 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And the playing field of the Ford Foundation is global in scope.
Right.
And so you're right. It's much more, you want to be much more prudent about the choices that you're making when you're within a big institution like that, because it can really, money is the oil in the social justice movements,
Yes.
right? Money is the oil. It makes things move. And you need to be cognizant of that power. And one of the things that I really wanted to make sure that we talked about today, Caroline, and which you asked about previously, is about this question of women in power.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because when you are a female leader, for me, I think the most important, there's many things to say about leadership, and I'm absolutely sure we'll get into it, but the most important thing is owning your own power.
Okay.
As a female.
And what do you mean by that?
In your leadership position. It's difficult, I think, for women often to own their own power when they're in positions of leadership. And that has to do with the usual conversation around being aggressive. And when you're aggressive in certain kinds of environments, people are not appreciative. It's not appreciated. Or being the whole genre of the whole idea of being a good girl. What does that mean in different societies? And in most societies, that means being a quiet girl. Not Dutch society, which is one of the joys of living here, I have to say. But it means behaving. It means following social norms that have been set out for you. And when you're in a position of leadership, if you do that, it's much more difficult to lead. Though we have language for it now, facilitated leadership, stewarded leadership, those kinds of issues. Mm-hmm. But power for me is responsibility. And when I was being coached and in this position of power with the Ford Foundation, I was told by my coach, Lisa, you have to own that power, because that power is a responsibility to be able to create change in a much larger way and a much larger scale than you have had the opportunity to do before. So you have to take that as a responsibility. That power is a responsibility, and you have to work with it as a responsibility that you've been given, but that you also earned. And for me, that was a really, really important mentoring moment in my career, was being told to own my own power.
And Lisa, this was like a turning point, this mentoring moment. What did you experience before that mentor moment? Like what was going on with you and your power?
My voice was tentative. It is not tentative anymore. I would articulate what I thought with a question behind it, as opposed to saying, this is what I think we should do. I have a very creative way of thinking about things, and I would dampen that down, because I would look for what would fit within the norms of the institution I was working for.
Right.
My coach said, don't do that. Throw it out there, because you have crazy ideas and they're really interesting. And it's why you were hired, because you have crazy ideas about how things work. So throw it out there and don't be shy about throwing it out there. So those are the things that really changed.
Right.
Throw your ideas out. Let people grapple with them. Don't be afraid if they're crazy. Don't speak with a question mark in your voice. That's not what you need to do. You know what you're talking about, so own it. And don't be afraid to lead people. Don't be afraid.
And after this mentoring moment, how did that implementation process go? I mean, did that change overnight for you, or was it a process?
That's a good question. I think it was like turning a switch on, actually.
Okay.
So I think it was absolutely immediate, because I was much happier. you're sitting in your skin, and you're just like, oh, wait a minute, he's right. And it was Rockwell leadership that took me through this process. And the whole process was right. I had a bunch of peers telling me this. I had a mentoring coach telling me this. And so the next time I sat at a table with people about how to create social change in global social movements, which is, what my responsibility was, I was like, let's think about this, and this, and then let the group grapple with those ideas and figure out what made the most sense for the indigenous communities, what made the most sense for the women's rights communities, what made the most sense, for LGBTQ communities, what was going to make the most sense for folks who were trying to change global institutions.
Right.
So it was like a switch. It was not a gradual process.
Well, that's actually really interesting. So you really stepped into your power as from then.
Yes. Yeah. And the thing to say about it, what was going on beforehand, was I was 20 years younger than my next colleague at
Right.
Ford. I was 20 years younger. There were only 3 of us. We were all women. We were very young by the standards of the institution. So there were only 3 young women in this role that the foundation had offered to us. And so when you're 20 years younger, you don't have a PhD, your credentials look totally different from your neighbor next to you or your colleague next to you, who hasn't written 1 book, has written 15 books, or, has, testified in front of the Congress or brought cases to the Supreme Court or whatever it happens to be, is a very strong and powerful person. You're like, I'm not sure. I don't have all those credentials.
And I can totally relate and understand as well, and I'm sure our listeners too. So I'm so curious, Lisa. Mentoring and coaching has helped you a lot to step into your power. What else helped you to do so? Were there any other support systems or things you did that helped or read?
I think understanding that the mindset of a leader has a lot to do with learning also helped. And that was a longer journey to understand that the innate curiosity of how things work, like how societies work or how systems work, or wanting to have a big picture of a big landscape around global politics and global social movements. And what does it mean when there's an environmentalist in Africa and there's an environmentalist in California? How do they come together to actually create change around a forest or a desert or so on and so forth? Understanding that, being curious about how that really works and how power works and how power shifts in the world was and that learning and being curious about it was an important part of your leadership role. This was also very, very important in terms of becoming more of a leader.
Yeah.
Just knowing that being curious and learning was a sign of leadership, and having other people validate that sign of leadership, that was also quite important. Right now with the Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation, Rob Kaplan has written tons of books on leadership. He teaches at Harvard on leadership, or so on and so forth. And even in my role today, he has validated this question about asking the right questions, about learning from your peers, about knowing that you will never, ever, ever know enough. No. And so you want to build a team around you that's going to help you learn.
Right. And also being humble about that. I mean, that's what I hear between the lines, right? That there's a kind of humbleness towards your own ability of knowing everything. That helps, I guess, also a lot.
There is an expression that A people hire A people, because, which I learned in one of my jobs, they hire A people because they know that they don't know.
Yes.
And so what they're going to do is they're going to hire somebody who does know. And then they're going to manage a team. You're not going to manage a triangle. You're not going to manage with you at the top and everybody responding and so on and so forth. What you want to do is you want to build a really strong team where everyone plays to their strengths.
Yes.
And everyone, and that's like, you know, that's like orchestrating a football match, or it's not an easy thing to do in that sense. And of course, it's learned leadership. It's also not, I don't think it's really the dominant image of a leader, you know. It's like,
no. So that's also like that was actually one of my next questions, so thank you. Because when we talk about power, and when we talk about women, and then also young women, we kind of have the feeling that these don't match, right? Because we have this image of leadership, of power, that is quite masculine and maybe has that triangle shape. And you referred also earlier to how you should sort of behave as a good girl. And I'm so curious how you look at being a woman, and the idea that we sometimes still have, or very often still have, on what it means to be a good, powerful leader.
So, you know, I think that if you come into your role with integrity,
right,
you can own your power, and you can be really strong with it, even aggressive with it, if you come with integrity into the role. So Janet Reno is she was the Attorney General under Clinton.
Yes.
Janet Reno, in my mind, was a phenomenal leader. So she led the judiciary in the United States under Clinton. She went through an impeachment process with Clinton, which some people thought was unfair, but he was her boss, and still she held him to account, which I just loved. And every single time she opened her mouth, you knew that Janet Reno was speaking from her heart. You knew that she was really smart, and she was also, so she was within the confines of her knowledge with the law. She had a tremendous command of the law, but she also had very strong value set. And you could see it every time. It's my job to protect the way in which the law is distributed across the United States. You could feel that every single time she opened her mouth. And so I think this question of integrity helps people be strong, especially women be strong in your leadership positions.
Right. And you refer to values, and you referred to that as well. How do you what are your values, and do you have the feeling that you can that you've always been able to lead from them?
Yeah. So, you know, we talked earlier, I really value equity in society.
Yeah.
I am often really concerned about who has power and whether they can be held accountable.
Right.
So how we get to participate, whose voices get heard. Is there accountability and transparency in our societies between those who have lots of power and those who have less power? Mm-hmm. And is there transparency in the way in which decisions are taken? And if you are impacted by a decision, do you have the right to be able to speak to that decision, to shape that decision? These are all the things that matter to me and have mattered to me for a long time. So nothing about us without us is the kind of a phrase that you hear. Mm-hmm. And that's true for whether you're dealing with education, do students get heard, do teachers get heard, who gets heard in the education system, whether you're dealing with health, especially women's health, do we have the right to be able to determine our own health? Whether you're dealing with the rights, who's got rights and who doesn't, or whether you're dealing with democracy or dictatorship or autocracy or so on and so forth. Doesn't matter. All of these equities are all of these values play out in all sorts of different ways. Have I always been able to operate full force with these values straight in front of me? Almost always, but not in every single position, because the more power you have as an individual, if you're running a big institution, if you're writing a law, for example, if you are if you're running a bank, you have challenges and choices that are put in front of you, and you don't always have the time to be able to speak to, is this the most equitable decision that I could take? Is it going to unleash equity in our system? Or maybe you're in an institution that doesn't value this the same way that you do. And that often is the case for people, that
Yes.
where they're working doesn't necessarily allow them to live their values. Well, my answer to that is get out.
Now, that was my next question. But yeah, so have you always looked closely whether the organization or the institution that you wanted to work for represented your values?
Could I actually operate from a values-centered position? Yes, always.
Right.
From the beginning. I mean, actually, every single place. Did it always pan out that way? No. Institutions can speak to say, yes, we value equity. Yes, we value, especially social institutions, which is where most of my career has been. Yes, we value this. Yes, we value that. But then you find out in the operating process how the institution actually breathes, or its processes, or so on and so forth, that maybe it's not really oriented in the same way that you thought it was oriented going in.
Right.
Or there can be a change of leadership, and the leadership at the top, because these are powerful positions, a leader may be chosen who is more interested in power than they are in the change that they can create in a position at a philanthropy.
Right.
And then you have some difficult moments of reckoning.
And Lisa, what is your advice? Because you pinpoint a very important thing, and that is the impact of power and what it can do to us as humans, right? And what it can do to our values sometimes as well. And I mean, we have a lot of examples of leaders that lost themselves through power, lost and didn't lead from their values that they initially said they would. Can you help us, can you help me and our listeners to understand, like, how can we work with that idea or that concept of power and stay connected to our values? Because that is, yeah, I think a very tough job sometimes, because our ego can get in the way. Yeah.
So, Caroline, the thing that I think is so critical goes back to the team that you're going to build if you're in a position of power.
Okay.
Why? If you have a team of people who know that they know things that you don't, and you have consistently reinforced the fact that they know things, and that's why they're on your team, or that's why they're part of this team, because they can do things that you may not feel that you have the skill set to be able to do, it keeps your ego in check.
Right.
And it keeps you tethered to the goal and mission and vision of the organization that you are working for, or the country that you're leading. We see these examples right now all the time in a very bad way. So
yes.
If you've got a strong team around you, that team keeps you tethered. And for me, that's always been really important as to how to live with the fact that you have a lot of power.
Right.
How you live with that. And, you know, power is intrinsic, but it's also external. You get power from position, but you also get power from where you're coming from inside of you, right? These are different kinds of power, but you do. So for me, what was important and what remains important, and one of the reasons why I love where I'm working right now at the Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation, is because there are 40 people on this team, and every single one of them is amazing, really strong skill sets, already have been through lots of career choices. Each one has led institutions. They've been CEOs, they've been executive directors. They've written many books. I've only written one. Wow. They're all incredibly powerful. And so you get this whole team of people who keep you grounded. Here's our mission. This is our vision. This is what we're going after. We're here to create impact and change in the world. We're here to solve complex social challenges at scale. This is what we're doing. And you don't get crazy about this concept of power. And you can see it even in politics. I mean, one of the reasons why the leadership in the United States was so difficult in the past 4 years is because there was no team around the president. Mm-hmm. He was constantly shifting people in and out. Then there's nobody to tether you to the goals and values of the nation in this kind of way. I mean, it's one of the reasons. There's many, many others, but I would articulate that this is one of the problems. It's one of the signs of weak leadership when you can't hold people in the positions which in and of their own right are quite powerful positions, but you can't hold them there because you're not consistent. You're not listening. You're not learning. The tone at the top is wrong. Yeah.
Okay. So building a strong team that really, that has strengths and skill sets that you don't have. And as a leader, surround you with them and also nurture the fact that they have those expertise that you don't have and create space, like hold space for that expertise. And meanwhile, stay focused on the mission and the vision and of the company or the institution that you work for. Is that a proper summary? Yeah.
That's a great summary.
Okay. Great. Okay. So Lisa, what I was interested in is that in the nonprofit or social sector, as you refer to it, I have the idea, and I also saw some numbers that more women are actually leading than in let's say the for-profit organizations. So I'm very curious, why do you think this is the case?
Oh, I think we're having all the fun.
Okay.
We're not building widgets.
No.
We're not building cars and we're not building airplanes, and those things are super important, really important. But we are building social opportunity.
Right.
We're building equity. We're building cooperation. We're able to cooperate with one another regardless of our institutional perches. You know, wherever you are sitting in an institution, you're able to build cooperative coalitions to solve healthcare problems, to solve education problems, to champion human rights. And I think that cooperative spirit, it speaks to women.
Less competition, you mean? There
are many people who run NGOs who would say, oh, are you kidding me? All we ever do is compete for money. That's how they would put it. But in fact, and yes, you have your brand and somebody else has their brand, and you all want, $5 from your neighbor or so on and so forth. Right. That's true. But in the mission of the organization and the vision of organizations, mm-hmm. that's a cooperative sphere. So there is some competition, but there's also this hugely important cooperative sphere. So I think that speaks to women. So I think that's one of the reasons why you see more women in the social sector. Mm. And it's a complex sector. This is another thing that I love about the sector. It's complex. There are no answers to loneliness. Why do we have these social deserts? There's no real clear path to solving a lot of the complex social challenges. It's one of the reasons why DRK looks for innovation.
Mm-hmm.
So we get to formulate answers. We get to actually grapple with really big social problems or really simple social problems where you need to build a pipeline of activities in order to be able to solve that problems, like cleft lips, for example. You know, when kids are born with problems with their speaking.
Right.
There's many different ways in which to solve problems, and so you get to be creative about how you go about doing that. So I just think it's a very attractive sector
Mm-hmm.
to work in.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's more cooperative, which I think speaks to many women in a different kind of way. It's and on the practical level, I have to say that the sector allows more flexibility in balancing the many different types of responsibilities that women are still shouldering today in 2021,
Yes.
more than many of our male counterparts. And so there's more flexibility in how you arrange your career, how you arrange your life patterns, if you will, and how you take care of personal and the political and the professional.
Right, right. We talk a lot about new leadership here in this podcast, and this was a very intuitive name actually for the podcast, because at the beginning I was not even sure what it actually meant. Right, new leadership, and we're trying to find that out together with our listeners and together with you. So I was. I'm curious. Do you feel that the type of leadership that is used in the social sector is the type of leadership we have to move towards into the more profit sectors as well?
There's a conundrum here about this fact that you put on the table, Caroline, which I think we should talk about.
Okay.
And the conundrum is that I'm in the business of supporting new social leaders, the next generation of social leaders. This is what DRK does.
Yes.
We find, fund, and support exceptional leaders who have new social enterprises. So here we are, new leadership, new social enterprises that are tackling society's most complex social challenges.
Right.
Right. So this is what I do. And this leadership comes with new labels today. It comes with the entrepreneur label.
Mm-hmm.
So we fund social entrepreneurs and social enterprises. This is all new language that has emerged in the last 10 years in the social sector.
Yes.
And impact investors, right? Mm-hmm. This is another piece of language that's emerged, who are looking to finance these kind of social enterprises, or so on and so forth. And what do we find? The patterns there is that young men get more financing under these labels of impact entrepreneurs, impact investing, social entrepreneurs than women.
Yes.
So the social sector, if you will, or the nonprofit sector, has more women leadership. But if you look at the patterns of where the money is going today, in this with this new labels on social leadership of social entrepreneurs and impact investing, that money is disproportionately going to men. And so it's a conundrum.
Yes, and this is everywhere in the investment sector, everywhere. Right? This is a big issue, and then we come back to that idea that or the concept that leadership or entrepreneurship, as you will, doesn't match in people's mind, in our unconscious, with a woman.
Isn't that interesting?
Well, it's
pathetic.
Yeah. Especially the last one, yeah.
Interesting wasn't the word you were looking for.
No.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's happening in your sector as well.
Yes, I find it extraordinary that there are special calls for social entrepreneurs through a gender lens, When
Yes.
we know in the more traditional, like in the NGO field, which is the old way that we used to talk about social engagement and the civic sector and civil society, there are women at the top.
Yeah.
And they're running big corporations or big NGOs, you know, which often look a lot like big corporations and dealing with very complex management issues and boards and fundraising machines and so on and so forth. And then when we get to the new and the innovative and so on and so forth, all of a sudden there's a skew, and you see that there's not parity, there's not equity even. So I find that remarkable. When we should be remarking on it like we are in this podcast. We should be remarking on this. How is this possible? And why is that happening? Is that the same old pattern repeating itself again in our new social sphere?
I'm afraid it is, Lisa, and it reminds me of that coding used to be a job for women, right? And that as soon as the idea came that coding is very difficult and very complex, that now it's suddenly a male thing, right? And that there are hardly any women to be found in coding land. Whereas, and I guess that's also with entrepreneurship. I mean, social sectors sounds more feminine, I guess. And then, but when you add entrepreneur, then suddenly there's
innovation.
Yes, and innovation
equals innovation.
Yes.
Innovation equals, I don't know, impact.
Yeah.
Impact is a very strong word, right?
Yes.
And it's what we aim for at DRK. We aim for scalable impact. That's the kind of things we're always going to be looking for and supporting. I don't think that we should allow for these concepts and these words and this trend to play out along gender lines in the way that it is right now. And fortunately, Draper Richards Kaplan also doesn't believe that we should be playing it out this way. And so there's a real strong approach to balancing the portfolio through gender lens, and also through the lens of racial equity, and through belonging, who belongs, who's allowed to belong. So we have a whole process that allows for our portfolio to be reviewed through the lens of, is it equitable?
Right.
Are we supporting as many women as men? Are we supporting as many people of color as we are people who are not of color? Are we supporting minorities and majority populations equally? So that we are not part of a trend that we can see.
Yeah.
Especially when you start looking at social enterprises that are for-profit enterprises, where there's an investment component to it, then you really see the women fall off the precipice.
And Lisa, how do you at DRK make sure that bias is the bias we're talking about is filtered out?
We run an equity lens every single month against the pipeline. That's how. So, and that lens looks for, and when you're filling out an application at the Richards Kaplan Foundation, we will ask you, which communities do you feel identified with? Which communities do you feel most comfortable with? What is your gender? And you have multiple boxes that you can tick, because that's, but we ask, and then we run a filter and check ourselves every single month. It's part of our managing director conversations every month.
Okay.
That's how.
Okay, so you deliberately set up a structure really to make sure that, and on a monthly basis, that you check upon, are we not biased in any way when it comes to investing in our portfolio, when it comes to attracting new companies?
So what is our bias? So that's your first question that you need to ask in any situation. What is the bias?
Right.
So can we recognize bias from our data?
Mm-hmm.
And then secondly, how do we correct for it?
Okay.
That's how I would articulate it. So how do we correct for it? If our pipeline has 30 organizations in it, pipeline meaning these are organizations we have not yet supported, but we're looking. If it's got 30 organizations and 25 of them are run by young men or 25 are run by young women, we see we have a bias.
Yes.
What are we going to do about that? The majority of the applicants are from majority communities, or the majorities from minority communities, then we can see our biases. And once you can see your biases, you can start correcting for them.
Right. So you use data for that initially, and you start from there.
Yeah, that's the idea. That's why we collect the data the way that we do.
Okay. And when we talk about social enterprises, Lisa, what well, we as new female leaders also, well, we are working towards that by we are a foundation, but we're also a BV in Dutch. Can you explain or elaborate a bit more on the concept of social enterprise for our listeners as well? What does it mean?
Yes, I recognize that the language is the language has not settled yet. Globally, it's not settled, which is quite interesting. Draper Richards Kaplan, we were the first venture philanthropy in the United States. It started in 2002. And as a venture philanthropist, what we were looking to do was to take the discipline and the practices of the marketplace and apply them against socially complex problems.
Right.
And so we weren't looking for a for-profit or a nonprofit. What we were looking for was how can we use the discipline of a venture capitalist and use that discipline to think about new solutions and new ways in which to solve poverty or solve inequity or solve human rights problems or solve education or health or so on and so forth. How could we do that? Can we take market-based principles? So when we started, or when Draper Richard Kaplan started with this concept, we were looking for impact first, and we're still looking for impact first. So it doesn't actually matter whether this is a for-profit or a nonprofit. What matters is the mission and the vision of the organization focused principally around the impact that they want to create in the world? Mm-hmm. And can you measure that impact?
Exactly.
That's really super important. And why is it important? Because it is the secret sauce of differentiating a non-social enterprise or a regular enterprise and a social enterprise. So when your board meets, is the first conversation you have around how many tons of waste you've pulled out of the waste stream? Is it how many people you provided with healthcare? Is it how many teachers or students you reached with your teacher training program? You can reach all of these kinds of goals with for-profits and nonprofits. The issue is this the first thing that your company, the model of business, or the model, your theory of change, are oriented around the social impact that you want to have in the world? So when DRK talks about social enterprise, this is what we mean. It's impact first. We're impact first, you're impact first. The impact that you want to have in the world looks like X, and this is how you measure it.
And and talking about the measurement, because that's not always an easy task, right? That's probably one of the hardest, I guess. So can you help us a little bit with maybe some ideas or tools or ways a social enterprise can measure its impact? And of course, it depends on in which industry it is in, but...
Yes. Okay, so let's just go through some examples.
Right.
Let's start with Draper Richards Kaplan.
Mm-hmm.
We measure our impact by how many lives are directly touched through the social enterprises that we support. So this is directly touched. And we know to date that we have been able to change 150 million lives with the funds that we have put out in the world. And we can measure that by looking at the way in which each one of the social enterprises measures their own impact.
Mm-hmm.
It's a count, it's a reach. It's simple, simple, simple. It's probably the simplest way in which to measure impact.
Yes.
We also look at how many tons of waste have we pulled out of the waste stream? How many tons of GHG emissions have we been able to reduce or offset? Mm-hmm. So very simple measurements that we use. Two are environmental and one is social, because we work across both social and environmental problems. Simprints, one of the groups that we support. This is a nonprofit group. Simprints believes that everybody has the right to be counted, and they provide people with a digital ID. And what that allows for is education services, health services, all sorts of social services become unlocked when you can be counted for. Simprints, we know to date, has been able to give 4.1 million people in this world a digital identity that has unlocked opportunity and social services for them. This is a very simple way in which to measure impact. Renewal Workshop here in Amsterdam. How much waste have they pulled out of the textile industry's waste stream? Yeah. How many gallons of water have they offsetted? How many GHG emissions have they offsetted? So their aim is 1 million pounds of waste out of the waste stream. It's a measurement impact, right? And their board, when their board meets, should be asking the question every single time, in the last quarter, how many pounds did we remove from the waste stream? This is a for-profit, right? So simple in your impact first, your impact on the world and on the social problem that you're trying to resolve is the way in which to measure your value. Now, for a for-profit, what ends up happening is that people get confused and they spend a lot of time looking at the profit and loss statement and the balance sheet, because they are both trying to create this impact in the world and have a commercial rate of return. And in fact, that is almost impossible. It is possible. There are some organizations that are able to do that. They're 1 in a million. Generally, when you're looking at both a financial return and a social return, you want to ensure that the challenge of pursuing the financial return does not get in the way of the type of impact that you could have. And so if you're a social enterprise who wants to raise equity or wants to raise money on the market, you have to really be thinking about what flavor of money is going to allow me to continue to grow my social mission. And then what you want is growth capital, durfkapital in Dutch. You want growth capital. Yes. Because growth capital is the kind of capital that's going to take you to removing 1 million tons of waste out of the textile waste stream. And so when you're an impact investor, when you're on the other side of the equation and you're investing, you should be really thinking about long-term, patient growth capital that allows a company to scale. And this is why we're a venture philanthropy. This is exactly why, because we're oriented around that scaling. We want to make sure that the social enterprise has big impact.
Yeah, and you're oriented on scaling the impact, not so much scaling the profit and loss. Right. But that's a super important distinction, that you're super careful when it comes to the values. And the intention really that you also talked about. Why do you want to invest? And from which value base do you come? Because as soon as there is this slight idea of, okay, but this is also an amazing business opportunity, then things get really wishy-washy. I don't know even if that's English word, but
as long as the social impact is baked into the business model, and this is the language that we're always using, is the social impact a byproduct of the business model?
Yes.
Or is the social impact actually baked into the business model?
Yeah.
So when it's baked into the business model, there should be no friction between growing the business and growing the impact.
Yeah.
But when it's not fully baked in, there can be friction between these two things. And then what generally happens is that your impact investors forget to ask about impact.
Yeah.
That's what happens. And we've seen it a number of times. And it's also why when we are talking about being a venture philanthropist, everybody who supports us, because we are also supported, we raise funds from donor partners and venture partners. We always tell them, look, this money is philanthropic money. And we may invest in a for-profit entity because baked into their business model is an opportunity to shift an industry, an opportunity to serve millions with healthcare, an opportunity to bring a market like Energy Peace Partners, which we started with, bring a market of renewable energy into a place that doesn't have it yet, last mile distribution of clean energy. There's an opportunity here to create change, social change, and solve a socially complex problem. And if we succeed and there's a return, that's going to go right back out to serve the next social entrepreneur.
Yes.
That's what it's going to do. So, and when we're talking to entrepreneurs, we never start with their business model. Never. We start with what's the change you want to create in the world. So, if I were interviewing you, Caroline, I'd say, Caroline, what is it that you want to do with female leadership? What is it that you want to see happen with women in female leadership, new female leadership? And then we would have a conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's so interesting, and it's such a different perspective, really, when it comes to investing. And I can imagine that since we talked about your values and also what you feel like is really important in your work, I think it feels like you're at the right place and the right person now leading this foundation. I was wondering, Lisa, you also mentor and guide the entrepreneurs of the companies that you invest in, right? Can you share a bit more on that, and what do you see are the biggest challenges they face from a leadership perspective?
Do you mind if I back up for a minute and talk about the market and the social sector? And then,
Sure.
There is a challenge, right? There is this challenge of here's the market and it's oriented towards a financial return, and here's the social sector and it's oriented towards a social return. What I love about the era that we're in, what I love about impact entrepreneurs, what I love about impact enterprises, social enterprises, so on and so forth, is that here is a whole generation of young social leaders who have decided, many of them, that what they want to do is build a company that has a social return.
Yes.
And that my generation didn't do this. I mean, they are doing it sort of, but it's not my generation that built this. It's the generation behind me that built this idea that the market also can create a social value and a social good, and explicitly create a social value and a social good, that we can have stakeholder companies as opposed to shareholder companies. What a fantastic thing. And it goes back to this question of power. I think these young people, younger than me, okay, so sort of young, they looked at where's the power in the world, and they didn't see power in public policy like I did when I was in my 20s. They saw that the power of the world's in the market. They said, well, let's make the market work for our societies in a much better way. And that's what they did. And I can't tell you how this for me is incredible. It's a new place in order to create social value that we always separated,
Exactly. Yeah.
Between government and civil society and the markets. And these kids are like, no way, we'll use all these instruments to get the world that we want. How fantastic is that? It's fantastic. And I get to work with them, which is also totally amazing. I think it's amazing. I get to work with them. I feel so lucky to work with these young people who, even in this pandemic, they're optimistic, they're courageous, they're tenacious. And they're not only solving social problems, but they're spreading hope with every action that they take. And if you ask me right now, especially when we're all sitting in our little Zoom bubbles, what we need is hope. We need to be inspired And these young people, these social entrepreneurs, they are so inspiring. And if I can take the journey that I've been on and use it to help them figure out how to get over their next hurdle, help them fundraise, help them build a board, very mundane, sort of boring things that matter if what you want to do is operate at scale, help them figure out what the middle management tier needs to look like, help them understand how to use grants and loans and equity all together to stack their capital in the right kind of way. All of these kinds of issues that DRK deals with leans in to deal with on a day-to-day basis with the social entrepreneurs. It's fantastic. It's a fantastic opportunity, all driven around impact.
Yes, and I think that you just touched upon a very interesting point that I consider also as new leadership, and that is that you indeed combine that social impact with building a business, and that's so ingrained in the business model, and that you really want to make this world a better place. Really, that's your starting point. And yeah, and I also love that what you're saying, that it's that well, I would say my generation does not see that separate. It does not say, okay, there is social and there's not social, and there is business and there's NGOs. No, and there's governments. No, we have to work together, actually, in order to create that hope and to make a difference for the future, really. Yeah.
I think you have an incredible expectation when you wake up in the morning and you say, it doesn't matter if I'm going to my job or I'm going to my kids' school or I'm going, to my kitchen. It doesn't matter. I want to create change.
Yes.
I want to make the world a better place. And that's what's happening.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a real gift, a gift from social entrepreneurs to the rest of the world.
Yeah. Wow, Lisa, I feel we could talk for hours. But unfortunately, I think we're already well past our 45 minutes for sure. So I was wondering, do you have any advice or important thing you want to share with the future female leaders or current female leaders that are listening right now?
Yeah. Own your own power. That would be my first point. Have fun. And if you're not in a position where you can actually live your values, create the conditions where you can, because that's entirely possible.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Lisa, for this amazing and super insightful interview. I hope everyone who listens enjoyed it as much as I do. And if you feel you want to share this with the world, make a print screen of this podcast, share it on your social media, share it on your Instagram stories. And Lisa, does the DRK Foundation has an Instagram? Because I couldn't find it. Is that correct?
We're on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter.
Okay.
And we have 2 websites, one in Dutch and one in English.
All right, perfect. So when you share it on Instagram stories, tag New Female Leaders, and we will make sure your insights and ideas that you have of this podcast will be shared. And if you share it on Facebook or on Twitter, make sure that you also tag the DRK Foundation. Lisa, once again, thank you so much for thank you for sharing your wisdom, and yeah, hope to speak soon.
Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.